Inherited wealth always has two faces. On one hand, it solves almost every material need a person can imagine. On the other hand, it binds its owner to invisible expectations, rules, norms, and obligations they never chose. For many of the daughters of American industrial empires in the late 19th century, money was not freedom, but a gilded cage polished with morality and honor. And among them, no one embodied this paradox more clearly than Edith Rockefeller McCormick. Edith was born in 1872, the third child of John D. Rockefeller, who was quietly transforming Standard Oil into America's greatest money-making machine, and simultaneously becoming one of the most controversial figures of the era. Yet, behind the glamorous facade of oil power, the Rockefeller family operated more like a Protestant monastery than a gilded playground. Money was abundant, but joy was distributed sparingly. Children meticulously record every penny of their allowance, confess even the smallest mistakes, and are taught that family wealth is not a personal privilege, but a God's mandate, to be justified by moderation, discipline, and goodwill. For a sensitive and imaginative girl like Edith, this framework both molded and eroded her. On the one hand, she fully absorbed the Rockefeller Code, order, frugality, and the moral purpose of money. On the other hand, Edith soon realized the outside world viewed her father as a cold, authoritarian figure, and within herself arose a yearning for beauty, music, language, and intellectual freedom, things that were difficult to reconcile with Baptist asceticism. Later observers of the family noted that Edith was the child who most clearly displayed restlessness, detesting her father's obsession with frugality, fascinated by European culture, and largely uninterested in the pragmatic habits he tried to instill. It was this very contradiction, between a fortune built on industrial power and a home governed like a cathedral, that sowed the seeds for Edith's unconventional path. While American society revered efficiency and frugality, she was drawn to art, opera, and the inner questions money could not extinguish. Her family saw it as a deviation. Edith, perhaps, was simply seeking a breather for a soul raised within iron discipline. Her teenage years were therefore not merely the opening chapter of a life of wealth, but a build-up of pressure that would explode when Edith faced choices that would shake both empires, Rockefeller and McCormick. From here, the story is no longer about how much money, but about how money will be used to save her inner self, and what the price will be. A dynasty marriage and the illusion of harmony. By the time Edith Rockefeller reached 19, her life no longer belonged solely to her family. It belonged to the American imagination. In the final decade of the 19th century, daughters like Edith were not simply young women. They were strategic assets in a social economy where marriages fused fortunes as effectively as corporate mergers. Newspapers followed their movements, society matrons evaluated their prospects, and European aristocrats watched closely, aware that American money was beginning to rival old titles. In 1891, Edith entered precisely such a union when she married Harold Fowler McCormick, the son of Cyrus McCormick, whose mechanical reaper had transformed agriculture and created another industrial dynasty. To the public, the marriage represented perfection. Rockefeller oil wealth joined with McCormick agricultural machinery, symbolizing a new American aristocracy built not on castles and coats of arms, but on factories, trusts, and global markets. The wedding itself was a major society event, widely understood as the formal alliance of two empires. Almost immediately after, the couple's relocation to Chicago shifted the city's social gravity. With their combined names and capital, Edith and Harold became the uncontested royal couple of Midwestern high society. Their presence elevated Chicago's cultural ambitions, signaling that the city was no longer merely an industrial hub, but a contender in the national, and even international, cultural hierarchy. For Edith, Chicago offered something Cleveland never had: scale. It was a city large enough to accommodate the cosmopolitan self she had long imagined. While Harold immersed himself in the expansion of the McCormick business interests and engineering ventures, Edith discovered a stage upon which she could redirect her inheritance away from the restrained, morally framed charity her father favored. Instead, she began to envision money as a tool for shaping inner lives, through art, music, opera, and the cultivation of taste. From the outside, the McCormick household appeared triumphant: vast estates, glittering social calendars, and 5 children who seemed to secure the dynasty's future. But beneath the surface, the marriage was already under strain. Harold was practical, restless, and oriented toward machinery, efficiency, and progress. Edith, by contrast, gravitated toward ideas, beauty, and an increasingly spiritual search for meaning that he neither shared nor fully understood. Tragedy deepened these fractures. 2 of their 5 children died young, losses that struck Edith with devastating force. Rather than drawing the couple closer, grief amplified existing distances. Edith's long-standing struggles with depression, nervous exhaustion, and physical illness intensified, while Harold responded by retreating further into work and technological pursuits. They occupied the same social world, yet lived increasingly separate inner lives. By the early 1910s, the accumulated weight of bereavement, marital alienation, and chronic ill health left Edith convinced that neither conventional medicine nor traditional religion could offer her relief. The dynastic marriage that had promised stability instead became a silent crucible, compressing her unresolved conflicts between duty and desire. What had once looked like a flawless alliance of wealth now felt, to Edith, like another beautifully furnished cage. It was at this vulnerable moment, when the structures meant to protect her seemed only to confine, that Edith began listening for alternative voices. News drifting across the Atlantic about radical new approaches to the human psyche would soon offer her not just treatment, but a complete reimagining of who she was allowed to become. The flight to Zurich. When a Rockefeller chose the mind over the marriage. By the early 1910s, Edith McCormick's inner world had reached a breaking point. Years of unresolved grief, chronic illness, and emotional isolation had eroded her faith in the systems she had been taught to trust: medicine, religion, marriage, and even money itself. The dynastic life that promised meaning through duty now felt hollow, incapable of explaining her suffering, let alone curing it. At precisely this moment, a rupture was unfolding in European intellectual circles that would change the course of her life. The famous partnership between Sigmund Freud and a younger Swiss psychiatrist, Carl Gustav Jung, had collapsed. Where Freud emphasized repression and sexuality, Jung spoke of dreams, symbols, myths, and a deeper psychic inheritance shared by all humanity. For Edith, Jung's ideas sounded less like clinical treatment and more like spiritual rescue. In 1913, at the age of 41, Edith made a decision almost unheard of for a woman of her social rank. She did not simply seek a second opinion or take a restorative trip abroad. She effectively left her husband, her children, and her carefully maintained social position behind, and relocated to Zurich to undergo intensive psychological analysis with Jung himself. What was expected, by her family and perhaps even by Edith, to be a temporary intervention became something far more radical. Zurich turned into an 8-year exile. Edith arrived as a wealthy, emotionally shattered patient, but over time she became one of the most important figures in Jung's orbit, financially, socially, and intellectually. Her analysis was exhaustive. It stretched across years and plunged into childhood memories, religious imagery, dreams filled with archetypal figures, and the deep conflict between her Rockefeller upbringing and her personal longings. Jung did not merely treat her symptoms. He encouraged her to reinterpret her entire life narrative. In this process, Edith found something she had never known within the Rockefeller world: permission to prioritize her inner truth over external duty. Money soon followed meaning. Edith's patronage extended far beyond paying for her own treatment. She became a primary financial supporter of Jung's emerging institutions, funding the Zurich Psychological Society and the Psychological Club, underwriting lecture programs, training analysts, and securing physical spaces where Jung's ideas could take institutional form. Without her backing, Jung's work might have remained a marginal, German-language offshoot of Freudian theory. Perhaps most consequentially, Edith financed the translation of Jung's major works into English. This single act opened American and British intellectual markets to his ideas, laying the groundwork for Jung's eventual global influence. What began as personal therapy quietly became cultural infrastructure. As her involvement deepened, Edith transitioned from patient to practitioner. She studied Jungian theory, attended case discussions, and was eventually recognized by Jung as a lay analyst, someone qualified to treat patients despite lacking formal medical credentials. Wealthy Americans traveling to Zurich for analysis often found themselves reassured, and intrigued, to see a fellow heiress seated in the analyst's chair. Edith's beliefs, however, did not stop at Jung's framework. She layered astrology, reincarnation, and cosmic symbolism onto analytical psychology, reading birth charts alongside dreams and interpreting past lives as metaphors for present suffering. Within Jung's circle, she was admired as a generous benefactor and tolerated as an unorthodox mystic. Back home, she was becoming something else entirely. To the Rockefeller family, and to American society at large, Edith McCormick was now the scandalous heiress who had gone to Europe, fallen under a psychiatrist's spell, and abandoned everything her upbringing held sacred. By the time she finally returned to Chicago in 1921, the woman who stepped off the ship bore little resemblance to the daughter who had left. What awaited her was not reconciliation, but reckoning. Return, rupture, and the price of reinvention. When Edith McCormick returned to America in 1921, she did not come back as a repentant wife seeking restoration. She returned as a transformed woman, self-identified as a Jungian healer, intellectually independent, spiritually experimental, and profoundly out of step with the social order she had once embodied. Chicago, however, had not transformed with her. The marriage she had left behind was already hollow. Harold Fowler McCormick moved swiftly toward formal separation, filing for divorce and signaling his willingness to allege adultery, an explosive accusation in the early 1920s, particularly against a Rockefeller daughter whose European years had already fueled gossip. What followed was not merely a personal breakup, but a legal and financial battlefield. The divorce proceedings were protracted, public, and ruthless. At stake was not only alimony and custody, but the disentangling of deeply interlocked Rockefeller and McCormick assets, grand estates, charitable commitments, trust income, and the maintenance of a highly visible social role. Lawyers on both sides worked to protect dynastic interests rather than personal reconciliation. By the time the settlement and associated legal costs were fully tallied, Edith found herself owing more than $800,000, a staggering sum in the early 1920s. It was the first unmistakable sign that her spending, philanthropy, and patronage had begun to outpace the income she could reliably access. To maintain the life she had built, one centered on psychological work, cultural projects, and large properties, she increasingly relied on borrowing against future trust distributions and pledging securities as collateral. In effect, she was consuming the very capital meant to sustain her over a lifetime. At this exact moment, her father's financial genius turned against her. John D. Rockefeller had spent years restructuring his fortune into foundations and carefully drafted trusts, the Rockefeller Foundation, the General Education Board, and other institutions designed for tax efficiency, longevity, and strict capital preservation. These structures were brilliant for philanthropy, but merciless when individual family members needed liquidity. Edith did not control vast pools of cash. Her wealth flowed through trustees bound by legal obligations to future heirs and institutional missions. The conflict reached its most dramatic point in the mid-1920s, when a massive stock dividend, approximately $7.5 million in Standard Oil of Indiana shares held in trust, became the subject of brutal litigation. Edith argued the windfall should be treated as income payable to her. Her ex-husband, children, and Rockefeller institutions countered that it belonged to the trust principal. The legal fight stretched across courts in Indiana and New York, pitting one financially strained woman against a coalition fortified by elite lawyers and institutional power. The outcome was devastating. The trusts prevailed, confirming a harsh reality. The Rockefeller financial machine was designed to preserve capital, not rescue individual beneficiaries from personal collapse. Meanwhile, Edith's Grand Lake Forest estate, named Villa Turricum, after the Latin name for Zurich, stood as a silent liability. Its vast acreage, Italianate terraces, and constant staffing demands generated enormous expenses while producing no income. Taxes rose. Buyers vanished. What had once symbolized her European rebirth became an anchor pulling her deeper into financial trouble. Still, Edith refused to retreat. Convinced that her vision held moral and psychological truth, she continued spending on architecture, culture, and Jungian-inspired real estate schemes intended to express a harmonious, ordered way of life. The timing could not have been worse. As the 1920s advanced, the foundations of her world began to crack, not just personally, but economically. And soon, forces far larger than Edith McCormick would finish what the divorce had begun. Speculation, debt, and the slow collapse of a fortune. By the mid-1920s, Edith McCormick's financial life had entered a dangerous phase where belief outpaced arithmetic. She was no longer merely spending income, she was wagering her remaining capital on visions that assumed the future would remain generous, liquid, and endlessly forgiving. It would not. At the center of this gamble stood Villa Turricum, her vast lake forest estate named after the Latin word for Zurich. Conceived as a physical expression of the Jungian ideals that had reshaped her identity, the property was monumental in scale and ambition. Terraced gardens, imported architectural elements, and year-round staff transformed it into a private philosophical statement, but also into a financial sinkhole. The estate produced no revenue, demanded constant maintenance, and generated rising tax obligations just as Edith's access to liquid funds tightened. Rather than downsizing, Edith doubled down. She poured money into speculative real estate development, channeling large sums to architects and planners from her Zurich circle. Most notably, she endowed architect Edward H. Bennett's associate Edward Kren with a reported trust of roughly $17 million, earmarked for visionary building projects inspired by Jungian concepts of harmony, order, and psychic balance. These developments were intended to reshape how people lived, beautiful environments designed to heal the modern mind. The timing could not have been worse. Many of these projects took form just as easy credit and inflated land values began to wobble. As confidence faltered, buyers disappeared. Financing dried up. Construction stalled. What had seemed like enlightened patronage now looked like reckless exposure. Edith found herself holding vast, illiquid assets precisely when she needed cash the most. Then came the larger catastrophe. After 1929, the American economy slid into the Great Depression, crushing investment income and freezing markets for luxury properties. Estates like Villa Turricum, once symbols of elite permanence, became nearly impossible to sell at any price close to their former valuation. The very assets that might have saved Edith instead locked her into place. Inside the Rockefeller family, alarm bells were now ringing openly. Internal financial reviews circulated by 1931 described Edith as being on the edge of bankruptcy, a stunning verdict for a woman once counted among the richest daughters in America. Decades of spending on opera, art, Jungian institutions, speculative architecture, and philanthropy had hollowed out her personal fortune. Layered on top were divorce settlements, legal fees, and the relentless carrying costs of properties designed for a world that no longer existed. Yet even as the numbers turned brutal, Edith refused to abandon the identity she had forged. Back in Chicago, she reinvented herself once more, this time as a full-time Jungian analyst. She opened a practice and treated dozens of patients, many of them wealthy socialites drawn by the novelty of being analyzed by a Rockefeller. Often she charged little or nothing at all, effectively using what remained of her capital to subsidize therapy for an elite clientele. The city's reaction was divided. Some found her fascinating, others found her dangerous. Gossip columnists labeled her the renegade Rockefeller, portraying her as an imperious mystic dabbling in European occultism. Protestant respectability recoiled from astrology, dream analysis, and talk of past lives. Edith had become a paradox even to herself, financially collapsing, yet spiritually convinced she was finally living in truth. By the early 1930s, the arithmetic was inescapable. Credit had tightened, assets could not be sold. Income streams shrank, the vision that once promised liberation now stood exposed to a merciless economy. And as her finances deteriorated, so did her body. Illness, death, and a fortune reduced to fragments. By the early 1930s, Edith McCormick's life had narrowed to a grim convergence of physical decline and financial collapse. Years of psychological strain, relentless spending, and economic catastrophe had left her body as depleted as her balance sheets. When breast cancer overtook her, it advanced quickly, mirroring the speed with which the remaining structures of her fortune were giving way. In 1932, at the age of 60, Edith died. The shock was not her passing, but the condition in which she left the world. A woman once counted among the wealthiest heiresses in America did not die surrounded by preserved capital or orderly estates. She died encumbered by debt. Her Lake Forest estate, Villa Turricum, was effectively unsellable. The property, once envisioned as a sanctuary of psychological harmony, had become a decaying burden, already sliding toward the neglect that would ultimately lead to its demolition decades later. What portable wealth remained had to be converted into cash with urgency rather than strategy. Her famed emeralds and jewelry were sold off by her heirs, many pieces passing through Cartier, only to reappear adorning a new generation of wealthy socialites, including Barbara Hutton, another heiress whose life would become synonymous with extravagance and personal turmoil. Fragments of Edith's vanished fortune thus grafted themselves onto another troubled legend of American wealth. At the time of her death, Edith's debts appear to have exceeded what could be quickly realized from her remaining assets. The oft-cited figure of $5 million spent on Jungian projects was never a single reckless payment, but a retrospective estimate of cumulative outlay over roughly a decade, funding buildings, salaries, translations, stipends, and the dense web of cultural initiatives orbiting Carl Jung's circle. Over 3 decades, she is believed to have given away more than $10 million in total. Yet numbers alone do not explain her legacy. Without Edith McCormick's patronage, Jung's organizations would have struggled to secure premises, train analysts, and reach English-speaking audiences. Analytical psychology might have remained a marginal, German-language offshoot of Freudian thought rather than the global intellectual movement it became. Beyond Jung, Edith helped drive early grand opera in Chicago, strengthened major art collections, and donated the land that would become Brookfield Zoo, civic contributions that outlasted her financial ruin. In the end, Edith Rockefeller McCormick embodied a radical inversion of her father's philosophy. John D. Rockefeller had spent a lifetime teaching that wealth must be preserved, disciplined, and protected. His daughter chose instead to treat money as fuel for ideas, institutions, and inner transformation. The result was not financial survival, but something far more unsettling: a Rockefeller who died broke, having spent her fortune not on luxury, but on meaning. Her story leaves behind an uncomfortable question that still resonates today. Is wealth meant to be guarded, or is it meant to be burned in pursuit of vision? Legacy reconsidered, failure, vision, or a warning from old money. History is rarely kind to women who spend money in ways society does not approve of. Edith Rockefeller McCormick has often been remembered as an eccentric, a cautionary tale, or worse, a wealthy woman who lost her way. But such judgments reveal more about the values of her world than about the reality of her life. Measured by her father's standards, Edith failed. She did not preserve capital. She did not grow the fortune. She did not submit to the quiet, disciplined stewardship that defined the Rockefeller financial creed. She died in debt, her estates dismantled, her name whispered with discomfort inside the very institutions built to protect family wealth. But measured by cultural impact, Edith's life tells a different story. Her financial backing transformed Carl Gustav Jung from a brilliant but marginal European thinker into a global intellectual force. By underwriting translations, institutions, and training programs, she ensured that analytical psychology crossed the Atlantic and embedded itself in American and British thought. Entire fields, from depth psychology to modern self-help culture, trace their lineage to structures she helped finance. In Chicago, her imprint was equally enduring. She strengthened the city's art institutions, fueled early grand opera experiments, and contributed land that became lasting public space. These were not acts of vanity consumption. They were investments in cultural infrastructure, projects whose returns were never meant to appear on a balance sheet. What made Edith dangerous to her contemporaries was not simply that she spent money, but how she spent it. She redirected wealth away from visible charity and into invisible realms: the psyche, the imagination, and the inner life. In a Protestant culture suspicious of mysticism and hostile to European intellectual imports, this was an unforgivable transgression, especially for a woman carrying the Rockefeller name. There is also a gendered dimension that history often ignores. Male industrialists who gambled fortunes on railroads, steel, or oil were celebrated as visionaries. Edith, who gambled on psychology, art, and spiritual meaning, was labeled unstable. Her failure was not merely financial, it was ideological, yet her story also contains a warning. Edith treated capital as if it were infinite, insulated by family name and institutional power. When reality intruded, through divorce courts, trust law, and economic collapse, the protections she assumed would hold proved brutally indifferent. Vision without financial restraint left her vulnerable, exposed, and ultimately destroyed. She stands, therefore, at a crossroads between two philosophies of wealth. Her father's model preserved dynasties but risked spiritual sterility. Her own model ignited ideas but consumed the fuel that sustained her life. Edith Rockefeller McCormick forces us to confront a question that old money has never fully resolved. Is the highest purpose of wealth preservation or transformation? Final synthesis. Why Edith Rockefeller McCormick still haunts modern wealth. More than a century after her birth, Edith Rockefeller McCormick remains unsettlingly relevant. Not because she was rich, America has produced countless wealthy heirs, but because she exposed a fault line that still runs through inherited wealth today: the tension between preservation and purpose. Edith was born into a system perfected by John D. Rockefeller, a man who transformed private fortune into institutional permanence. Trusts, foundations, and governance structures were engineered to outlive individuals, emotions, and personal crises. In that system, wealth was meant to endure by saying, no, no to excess, no to impulse, no to individual need when it threatened capital itself. Edith said, yes. Yes to inner transformation. Yes to ideas before arithmetic. Yes to the belief that money should serve meaning, not merely survive its owner. In doing so, she became a prototype for a modern dilemma. Today's heirs, tech fortunes, hedge fund dynasties, global capital families, face the same invisible pressure Edith felt: the expectation to justify their existence through stewardship rather than selfhood. Many comply, some rebel, few do so as openly or as expensively as Edith did. Her patronage ensured that Carl Gustav Jung reached the English-speaking world, reshaping how millions understand dreams, trauma, personality, and identity. That influence persists in therapy rooms, corporate leadership training, spirituality, and popular psychology. The return on that investment cannot be liquidated, but it is everywhere. And yet, Edith's life also illustrates the brutal indifference of financial systems once personal capital collides with institutional logic. When she needed help most, the Rockefeller machinery did exactly what it was designed to do: protect itself. Trust law replaced family loyalty. Preservation trumped compassion. The dynasty survived. Edith did not. She died without a fortune, but not without consequence. Her story endures because it refuses to resolve neatly. She was neither saint nor fool. She was a woman who treated money as combustible material, believing that burning it might light the way to something truer than comfort. Sometimes it did, sometimes it consumed her. In the end, Edith Rockefeller McCormick stands as a mirror held up to every generation of inherited wealth. She asks a question no trust document can answer: if money is meant to last forever, what, then, is a human life allowed to mean?